The church was already full when Margaret noticed the empty seat, not just any seat. The seat in the second row, left side, with the small white ribbon tied to the end of the pew. The seat she had reserved 6 months ago, with a handwritten card that said, simply, "For Dad." She was standing in the little room at the back of the church, the one with the cracked mirror and the folding chair, the one that smelled like old wood and candle wax. Her dress was the color of winter cream. Her bouquet, white roses and sprigs of baby's breath, nothing fancy, nothing expensive, was trembling slightly in her hands. Not because she was nervous about getting married. She had been ready for that for years. She was trembling because she had checked her phone 47 minutes ago and seen no message. No voicemail, no text that said running late or stuck in traffic or even sorry, can't make it. Just silence. The same silence she had been hearing from her father for most of her 34 years on Earth. Her maid of honor, Deb, was pretending not to notice. Deb was good at that, at filling the air with small talk when the real thing was too heavy to lift. She was saying something about the flowers on the altar looking beautiful, about how the light through the stained glass windows was hitting Margaret's hair just right, about how Daniel was going to cry the moment he saw her walk through those doors. Margaret was nodding. She was saying yes, and thank you, and I know. But her eyes kept going to her phone, dark and quiet on the little wooden ledge beside the cracked mirror. And then the wedding coordinator knocked twice and opened the door and said, "5 minutes, Margaret, we're almost ready for you." 5 minutes. Her father had not come. She picked up her bouquet a little tighter and looked at herself in that cracked mirror. And something passed through her face, something quick and dark, like a cloud across the sun. And then it was gone. And what replaced it was something harder to name. Not quite peace, not quite resignation. Something in between, something that had been growing in her for a very long time, through a very long education in disappointment. But what no one else in that church knew, not Deb, not Daniel, not the wedding coordinator with her clipboard, was that Margaret's story with her father was not over, and it would not be over for a long time. Because what was about to happen next, in that small church in the middle of an ordinary Saturday, would change not just her wedding day, but everything she thought she knew about where she came from. She would find out who she really was, and it would cost her more than she ever expected to pay. But first, let's go back. Let's go back to the beginning of Margaret. Because you cannot understand what she was holding in that bouquet unless you understand what she had been carrying her whole life. Margaret Ann Calloway was born on a Tuesday morning in November, the year the big ice storm hit and knocked out power to half the county. Her mother, Ruth, always said it was a sign, not a bad one, just a sign that this child was going to do things on her own terms, in her own time, regardless of what the world had planned. Ruth said it with a tired kind of pride, the kind that mothers develop when they have been doing everything alone for long enough that pride and exhaustion become the same thing. Her father, Thomas Calloway, was there for the birth. Ruth always said that too because she was fair, even when fairness cost her something. He was there, she said. He held Margaret for a few minutes. He had tears in his eyes. He said she was beautiful, and then, over the following years, he left. Not all at once. Not in a single dramatic exit with suitcases and slammed doors, though there were doors slammed, yes, there were plenty of those. He left the way some people leave, slowly, incrementally, a little more gone each time, until one day you look at the space where a person used to be and realize you cannot remember exactly when they stopped filling it. Margaret was 4 the first time she understood her father was different from other fathers. She was in preschool and they had a project, Draw Your Family. She drew her mother with yellow hair, even though Ruth's hair was brown, because yellow was happier, she thought. She drew herself. Then she looked at the blank space on the paper where the father was supposed to go, and she thought about it for a long time, her crayon hovering. And then she drew a man with a blue shirt standing very far to the right, almost at the edge of the paper, almost falling off. Her teacher, Miss Paulson, had framed the drawings and hung them on the wall for Parents' Night. Ruth came and looked at Margaret's drawing for a long time without saying anything. Then she had taken Margaret's hand and said, in a voice that was very careful and very measured, "You're a good artist, baby." That was all, but Margaret had felt even at 4, even without the vocabulary for it, that her mother had understood something about that drawing that had nothing to do with art. Thomas showed up on some Christmases. Not all of them. When she was 6, he brought her a stuffed bear that was clearly meant for a younger child. When she was 9, he brought her a book about horses, which she had loved when she was 7, but had mostly moved past. When she was 11, he brought nothing, but he sat at the kitchen table and drank 2 cups of coffee and talked to Ruth in a low voice about things Margaret wasn't supposed to hear. And then he left before dinner and didn't come back for 2 years. Ruth never said a bad word about him, not one. That was Ruth's particular kind of grace, and it cost her plenty. She cleaned houses for a living. That was the simple way to say it, the way she said it to neighbors and school forms, and anyone who asked. She cleaned houses. She had a small roster of clients, 8, sometimes 10, spread across the nicer neighborhoods on the north end of town. She drove there in her grey Civic with the chipped bumper and the air freshener shaped like a pine tree, and she spent her days on her knees on other people's floors, scrubbing other people's bathtubs, folding other people's laundry with the precision and care she gave to everything she touched. She was good at it. She was thorough and she was trustworthy and she was invisible in the way that people in her position learn to be invisible. Not because they are small, but because smallness is what the job requires, and Ruth understood requirements. She had been meeting requirements her whole life. Margaret used to go with her in the summers, when she was too old for daycare and too young to be left alone. She would sit in the kitchen of whichever house they were in and do her workbooks or read her library books, while her mother moved through the rooms above and around her like a quiet current. She learned early how to be still in other people's spaces, how to touch nothing, how to take up as little room as possible. She also learned by watching and listening in the way children do, the precise vocabulary of condescension. There was Mrs. Patricia Hale on Birchwood Drive, who had the white carpets and the crystal figurines, and who paid Ruth every 2 weeks with an envelope of cash that she handed over as though she were doing Ruth a profound personal favor. Mrs. Hale had a habit of finding things to correct. The throw pillows on the sofa should face the other way. The bathroom towels should be folded in thirds, not halves. The kitchen smell, the one that came from the natural cleaner Ruth used because Mrs. Hale had claimed a sensitivity to chemicals. The kitchen smell was not quite right, was it? It had a sort of sourness to it. "I wonder if you might try the other brand next time," Mrs. Hale would say, in the tone she used for everything, a tone that was never quite rude enough to name, but was never quite not rude either. "I'm sure it's just a matter of finding the right one." Ruth would nod and say, "Of course, Mrs. Hale," and write the brand name in her small notebook. Margaret, age 8, sitting at Mrs. Hale's breakfast bar with her chapter book, would feel something hot rise up in her chest. She would stare very hard at her page without reading a word. One afternoon, she had looked up from her book and said directly to Mrs. Hale, who was standing in the kitchen doorway in her silk blouse, "My mum's cleaning is perfect. You just like finding things wrong." The silence that followed was extraordinary. Mrs. Hale had looked at Margaret as though Margaret were a piece of furniture that had unexpectedly spoken. Then she had looked at Ruth, who had gone very still by the sink. "She's spirited," Mrs. Hale said finally, with a smile that contained nothing warm. Ruth had finished the work, packed up her supplies, and walked Margaret out to the grey Civic without saying a word. She strapped Margaret into the passenger seat, walked around to the driver's side, started the engine. They were 2 blocks away before she spoke. "You cannot do that," she said. Her voice was quiet and controlled. "You understand me? You cannot do that." "But she was being mean to you." "I know she was. So why do we just—" "Because it's my job, Margaret. Because that is our roof, and that is your school clothes, and that is your lunch money. That is what her being mean buys us. Do you understand?" Margaret understood. In the way that children understand things that are too heavy for them, by carrying them without knowing what to call them. She carried it for years. She carried it all the way through high school, where she worked after school at the diner on Route 9, and handed most of her tips to her mother, even when Ruth said no, absolutely not. Keep it. She carried it through community college, which she paid for herself with a combination of those tips, a small scholarship, and a private loan that it took her 4 years to pay back. She carried it through the series of administrative jobs she worked in her 20s, each one slightly better than the last, each one requiring her to be twice as prepared and twice as composed as any of her colleagues, because she had learned at her mother's knee that for people like them, the margin for error was not a margin at all. She had been working at Haverford and Associates, a mid-sized insurance company, for 5 years when she met Daniel. He was a contractor they had brought in to overhaul the company's billing system, and he appeared in the office one Monday morning with a laptop bag over one shoulder and the mild, distracted look of someone whose brain was already 3 problems ahead of wherever his body was. He ran into Margaret, literally, physically turned a corner and walked directly into her in the hallway outside the break room, and she dropped her coffee and he dropped his bag, and they both bent to pick up the same things at the same time and knocked heads. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," he said, rubbing his forehead. "It's okay," she said, checking to see if her coffee cup had cracked. It hadn't. "Did I hurt you?" "My head has survived worse." He looked at her then, properly, with this expression of genuine concern that struck her because it was so unguarded. Most people in offices wore their faces like armor. This man was just open, like a window someone had forgotten to close. "I'm Daniel," he said. "I know," she said. "You're the billing contractor. Everyone's been talking about you. Good things, I hope. They said you're very good at your job, but you walk too fast in hallways." He had laughed at that, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and Margaret had felt something shift slightly in the air between them, the way barometric pressure shifts before weather changes. 3 weeks later, he asked her to dinner. She said yes. 6 months after that, she met his parents, who were warm and slightly chaotic and owned a hardware store in Vermont. A year after that, he asked her to marry him in the kitchen of their apartment on an ordinary Tuesday evening, with no ring yet, because he wanted her to pick it herself. She said yes to that too. She called Ruth first. Then she thought about calling her father. Thomas Calloway had been living in Phoenix for the past 8 years, as far as she knew. They spoke on the phone 3 or 4 times a year, uncomfortable calls, filled with long pauses and surface questions, the conversational equivalent of 2 people passing in a hallway and neither one knowing whether to stop. He always said he was doing well. He always asked about work. He never asked about anything deeper than work, because deeper things required a kind of presence he'd never figured out how to offer. She called him anyway. She told him she was getting married. She told him the date. She told him she wanted him there. The pause on the other end of the line was long enough to have its own geography. "That's great, sweetheart," he said finally. "Really great. I'm proud of you." "I want you to walk me down the aisle, Dad." Another pause. "Well," he said, "let's see how things look as we get closer. It's a busy time of year for me." And there it was. That was her father. That was the sentence that had defined so much of her life. Let's see how things look as we get closer. The promise that wasn't a promise. The maybe that meant no without having to say no. The door held slightly open, just wide enough to keep her hoping, just narrow enough to make sure she'd have to squeeze. She'd said okay. She'd said she understood. She'd gotten off the phone and sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall for a while. Daniel had come in and found her there. He sat beside her without asking, just put his hand over hers, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he didn't say anything, which was exactly right. Over the following months, the wedding plans were built carefully around that uncertain space. She sent her father a formal invitation. She reserved the second-row seat with the white ribbon. She even wrote him a letter, a real one by hand, 2 pages, in which she said, as plainly as she could, that she knew they hadn't been close, that she knew there was a lot of history between them that had never been properly addressed, but that she wanted him there, and that whatever had been difficult between them, she was willing to set aside for this one day. He had called after receiving the letter. He said it was a beautiful letter. He said of course he was going to try to be there. He said try, and now it was the morning of the wedding, and the seat was empty, and the wedding coordinator was telling her she had 5 minutes, and Deb was talking about the light through the stained glass windows, and Margaret was holding her trembling bouquet and looking at herself in the cracked mirror and deciding one more time to let go. She had become expert at letting go of Thomas Calloway. She had been practicing since she was 4 years old, standing at the edge of a drawing with a crayon in her hand. She could do it again. She looked at herself in the mirror. She squared her shoulders. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, the way her therapist, Carol, had taught her. She thought of Daniel's face. She thought of Daniel's hands. She thought of the Tuesday evening in the kitchen and the yes that had come out of her so easily, so without question, because it was the right yes, the first completely right yes she had ever said to anything. She was ready. Deb opened the door and held out her arm, and Margaret took it, and they walked down the short corridor toward the church doors. And then the side door of the church, the one that led in from the parking lot, the one that hardly anyone used, opened. And someone walked in, and Margaret stopped walking. If you're feeling what I'm feeling right now, watching this unfold, if your heart is doing that thing where it's not sure whether to sink or to rise, then hit that like button, because I promise you, this story is far from over. What just walked through that door will change everything you think you know about what Margaret was carrying. Keep watching. The person who walked through the side door was not her father. She knew that immediately, instinctively, the way you know the shape of someone you've been waiting for long enough that their outline is carved into you. This was not Thomas Calloway's height, not Thomas Calloway's posture, not the careful, slightly stiff way her father moved through spaces, as though he were always slightly worried about taking up too much room. This person was older, much older. A man, yes, but different, compact and deliberate in his movements, with white hair and a dark suit that was well made but not new. The kind of suit that had been kept carefully because it had been worn on important occasions before. He had a cane, a simple wooden one, and he leaned on it lightly, as though it was more habit than necessity. He looked around the vestibule of the church with the careful thoroughness of someone taking inventory, and then his eyes found Margaret, and he stopped. She stared at him. He stared at her. "You must be Margaret," he said. His voice was gravelled with age, but clear. A precise voice. A voice that had once been used to giving directions and had not entirely forgotten how. "Yes," she said slowly. "Who are you?" He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she couldn't quite read, something layered in it, something that involved more than this moment, more than this church, more than the two of them standing in a vestibule on a Saturday morning. "My name is Robert," he said. "Robert Calloway." The name hit her like cold water. "Calloway," she repeated. "Your grandfather," he said. "Your father's father, though I imagine he never mentioned me." The wedding coordinator was hovering at the edge of her vision with the clipboard, her expression frozen between professional calm and visible alarm. Deb had gone completely still beside Margaret, not breathing. Margaret looked at this old man with his cane and his dark suit and his clear, careful voice. She looked at the lines of his face, the architecture of his cheekbones and brow, and she felt something strange and vertiginous, because she recognized something. Not a memory. She had no memory of him. Something more fundamental, the recognition that lives in blood and bone before it ever reaches the mind. "You'd better come in," she said. He nodded. He walked beside her toward the doors that led into the church proper. They did not speak again before she had to take her place at the back of the aisle. But just before the doors opened, he turned to her and said very quietly, "Would you allow me to walk with you, if you want to?" I know this isn't the right time for this, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for a great many things, but I wanted to be here. I wanted you to know that someone from your family—" He stopped. He pressed his lips together. His hand tightened on the cane. "Someone who should have been here a long time ago is here now." Margaret stood at the back of that church with the doors about to open, with the organ beginning its first soft notes, with her bouquet of white roses trembling in her hands, and she looked at this stranger who shared her name, and she felt something enormous shift inside her, not healing, too early for healing, but the first tremor of something, the first crack in a very old wall. "Yes," she said, "walk with me." He offered his left arm. His cane was in his right, and she took it, and the doors opened. She did not cry until she reached Daniel, and then she did, quietly, the way people cry when they are feeling too many things at once, and the body just makes its own decision. After the ceremony, in the small reception hall attached to the church, white tablecloths, mason jars filled with wildflowers, string lights overhead, Ruth's potato salad, which was famous among everyone who had ever eaten it. Margaret found a moment to sit beside Robert at a table near the window. He had a glass of water in front of him. He wasn't eating much. He kept looking around the room with that careful, inventory-taking look, and sometimes his gaze would land on something. Margaret's mother across the room, Ruth in her good blue dress, laughing with Daniel's mother. And something in his face would go briefly complicated. "Tell me," Margaret said, "all of it, whatever there is." He looked at her. He nodded, slowly, as though he'd expected this and had been preparing. "I live in Oregon now," he said. "I've been there about 12 years. Before that, Cincinnati. Before that, a lot of places." He paused. "I found out about you, about your existence, about 7 years ago. Your father and I had been estranged for a long time. When we reconnected briefly, he mentioned you. He mentioned Ruth. He mentioned—" Another pause. "He mentioned that he hadn't done right by either of you." 7 years ago," Margaret said. "Yes, and you're here now." "I wrote you a letter," he said. "About 2 years ago. I addressed it to an old address I had for your mother. I don't know if it ever arrived." Margaret thought of the small apartment where she and her mother had lived until she was 12, on Greenbrier Street, with the mailbox that had a bent latch. She shook her head slowly. "I tried to find a current address," he said. "I tried for a while, and then I'm 81 years old, Margaret. I ran out of courage for a while. That's no excuse. That's just the truth." She sat with that. 81 years old, a wooden cane, a dark suit kept carefully for important occasions. "How did you find me now?" she asked. "Thomas," he said. "Your father called me last week. He told me about the wedding. He told me he wasn't going." His voice tightened almost imperceptibly on that last sentence. "He said he couldn't face it, said he wasn't, that he felt he didn't have the right to be there, that your happiness was real, and it was his job not to ruin it by showing up as what he is." He stopped. I don't know if that was generosity or cowardice, probably both. Thomas has always been both, in equal measure. Margaret said nothing. There was nothing in that sentence she could disagree with. So I came instead, Robert said, because someone needed to be here, because you are the only grandchild I have in this world, and I have spent too long being the kind of man who finds reasons not to show up, and I'm too old now to be that man anymore. The string lights overhead cast a warm, golden light across the table. Outside the window, the afternoon sky was that particular blue that only October afternoons ever achieve, deep and clear and slightly melancholy. Margaret thought of her mother, 12 years old, cleaning Mrs. Hale's white carpets in the summer. She thought of herself in the cracked mirror with the trembling bouquet. She thought of the drawing with the man at the very edge of the paper, almost falling off. "I have so many questions," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "I have answers to some of them. Some of the others I don't have good answers to. And some of them you may not want the answers to. Tell me anyway." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded, and he began to talk. This is where the story opens into something larger, something deeper, something that goes back further than Margaret, and further than Thomas, and further than Ruth, standing at Mrs. Hale's sink with her face carefully composed. This is where you begin to understand that a family's silences are always a structure, that they have load-bearing walls, and that if you take too many of them down at once, things can fall. Robert Calloway had been a complicated man in a fairly simple way, which is to say that he had loved his son and shown it almost entirely through the forms of love that do the most damage: control, expectation, the constant implication that the love had conditions attached and that the conditions were not being met. He had wanted Thomas to take over his business, a small but successful plumbing supply company in Cincinnati. Thomas had wanted to study music. This sounds perhaps like a minor disagreement, the kind that families absorb and recover from, but in the particular atmosphere of the Calloway household, in those particular years, it had become something different. It had become a war of silence. Years of dinners where the thing that mattered most was never mentioned. Years of phone calls that circled the wound without ever touching it until the wound had its own gravity and everything fell into it. Thomas had abandoned music in his mid-20s. He had never taken over the business. He had drifted from city to city and job to job and relationship to relationship, trailing the particular damage of a man who learned early that the things he loved were things to be ashamed of, and who never quite recovered from that lesson. "I know what I did," Robert said. "Not with drama. Just plainly, the way very old men sometimes speak about very old wrongs, when there's no time left for anything but plainness. I broke something in him that never healed right. I know that. I have known it for a long time. Then why—" Margaret stopped herself. "Why didn't I fix it?" "Yes." He looked down at his water glass. "Because fixing something means admitting you broke it. And I was 65 years old before I knew how to do that. And by then so much time had passed, and your father, he was so far gone into his own damage by then, that even when I tried to reach him, there was very little left of the person I needed to reach." He paused. "That is also something I have to live with." Margaret thought about her father calling Robert last week, telling him about the wedding, saying he couldn't face it, saying he didn't have the right. She had spent so much of her life being angry at Thomas Calloway, a banked, low-burning anger, that she'd learned to live around the way you learn to live around a bad knee or a draft from a window that won't quite close. She had never spent much time being sad for him. It was harder, somehow. Sadness required a kind of imagination. You had to be able to see the person clearly enough to feel for them, and she had spent so long managing what Thomas made her feel that she had kept him deliberately blurry. But now, Sitting beside this old man in the October light, she let the image of her father come into focus, just for a moment. A boy who had loved music and been made ashamed of it. A man who had drifted. A father who had kept his daughter at arm's length his whole life because getting close meant being seen, and being seen meant being judged, and the only judge that had ever mattered to Thomas Calloway had already rendered his verdict decades before Margaret was born. She didn't excuse him. She wasn't there yet, and she might never be, but she felt something shift, slightly, in the way she held what had happened. "He called you," she said. "Last week." "Yes. After all this time." After all this time. What did he say? Exactly. Robert was quiet for a moment. He said, "Pop, there's a wedding. My daughter's getting married. She sent me an invitation and a letter, and she reserved a seat for me, and I can't go." And I said, "Why not?" And he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "Because she did everything right and I did everything wrong, and I don't know how to sit in a room full of that." Margaret closed her eyes. "And then he said, 'Would you go? Would you go for me? Would you go and tell her?'" Robert's voice caught briefly, and he cleared his throat. He said, "Tell her she turned out better than I deserved. Tell her I know that. And if she can find it in herself someday, not today, not now, but someday, I'd like to hear her voice." The string lights glowed. The room filled with the sound of people being happy, of forks on plates and glasses lifting, and Ruth laughing again across the room, full and unguarded. Daniel was talking to Roberts, to her grandfather's, other side of the room. She noticed him glancing over with questions in his eyes that he was saving for later because he loved her and he understood timing. Margaret sat with everything she'd just been handed, turned it over in her mind, the way you turn something fragile over to check for cracks. Her father had not come. Her father had called his own father, a man he'd been estranged from for years, a man with a cane and an old dark suit, and asked him to go in his place. This could be read as cowardice, and she had read it that way initially, in the first cold rush of hearing it. But sitting now in the October light, she was starting to read it differently. It was still cowardice. She wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. Thomas Calloway had spent his entire life choosing the easier version of the harder thing, and this was no different. But it was also, she searched for the word, it was also an act of admission. He knew he'd done wrong. He knew she deserved better. He'd sent someone in his place, not to escape accountability, but because he understood, perhaps for the first time, with the kind of clarity that finally breaks through in people at a certain age, that she needed someone there more than she needed him there specifically. He had known he would ruin it, and he had tried, in his imperfect, inadequate, too little too late way, not to ruin it. "He loves you," Robert said, "in the ways he knows how, which are not enough ways, not nearly enough. But they exist." She looked at the old man. He was watching her steadily, this stranger who was her grandfather, this man who had broken things and tried slowly and imperfectly to understand what he'd broken. "I know," she said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it. And here, right here, in this moment between the main course and the cake, in the hum and warmth of this small reception on an October afternoon, here was when everything Margaret thought she understood about her family turned inside out. Because Robert reached into the inside pocket of his dark suit and took out an envelope. A plain envelope, white, sealed, with her name written on the outside in handwriting she didn't recognize. "He sent this," Robert said. "He asked me to give it to you. Not before the ceremony, after. He knew it should be after, when things were settled." He held it out. "You don't have to read it today, or ever. That's your right." She took it. She held it in both hands and felt its weight, which was minimal. A single sheet of paper, maybe two, and also enormous. The way some small things are enormous, the way a folded note or a voicemail or a drawing of a man at the edge of a page can contain whole architectures of feeling. She set it on the table in front of her. She looked at it. She looked at Robert. "Stay," she said. "Please stay for the cake. I'd like to introduce you to my mother." Something moved through his face at that, something old and complicated and painful. "She may not want to meet me," he said. "She might not," Margaret agreed, "but let me ask her." She stood. She crossed the room. Ruth was there by the window in her good blue dress, her hand around a glass of white wine, her eyes already finding Margaret coming toward her, because that was what Ruth did, tracked her daughter across rooms with the careful vigilance of someone who had learned that the people who don't get watched tend to fall. "Mom," Margaret said, "there's someone I need to tell you about." Ruth looked past her toward the table where Robert sat. Her face did not do what Margaret expected. There was no surprise, no alarm. Ruth's face did something quieter, something that looked almost strangely like recognition. "I know who he is," Ruth said. "What?" Ruth took a careful sip of her wine. "I recognized him when he walked in. I met him once, years ago, before you were born. Your father brought me to Cincinnati for a weekend. I only saw him for an hour or two, but—" She paused. "I remember faces. Did you know he was coming?" "No." A pause. "But I'm not surprised." Margaret stared at her. "Mom!" Ruth looked back at her calmly. "There are things I've waited a long time to say to that man," she said. "Some of them are not very nice things." "That's fair. But some of them are just true things. And true things should be said eventually." She took another sip of wine. "Give me 5 minutes, then take me over. This is the moment. Hold on to it." Because what was about to happen in the corner of that small reception hall between Ruth Calloway and the father of the man who had failed her was going to crack something open in all three of them that had been sealed for decades. And sealed things, when they finally open, don't open quietly. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Someone who's been carrying something heavy, someone who's been waiting for an apology that never came, someone who's been standing at the edge of a drawing with a crayon in her hand. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it right now. Stories like this one go up every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming. Ruth took her 5 minutes. She stood at the window and looked out at the October sky and did what Margaret had seen her do 1,000 times before. Composed herself, arranged herself, decided what she was going to allow herself to feel and what she was going to hold back. The way a person manages a fire, keeping it useful, not letting it get wild. Then she set down her wine glass and walked across the room with her head up and her shoulders back, the way she always walked, the posture of a woman who had never been given any particular reason to hold herself that way and had decided to do it anyway. Margaret walked beside her. Robert saw them coming. He put both hands on the table and pushed himself slowly to his feet, with the dignity of old men who refuse to let their bodies make their apologies for them. He stood straight. He looked at Ruth. Ruth stood in front of him and was quiet for a moment that stretched to the edge of comfortable and then past it. Then she said, "You should have been in that boy's corner." Her voice was not loud. It was very clear. "Yes," he said, "I should have. He didn't know how to be a father because you didn't know how to be one." "Yes, that doesn't excuse him. I want you to understand that I'm not excusing him. I know. But it does explain a few things I've spent a long time trying to explain." She looked at him steadily. "I raised her alone. I raised her well. I need you to see that." "I can see that," he said. His voice was rough with something. "Anyone who looks at her can see that." Something shifted in Ruth's face, the precise, controlled expression softened by degrees, not all at once, not into tears, just into something less armored, something more present. "You're going to sit down," she said, "and you're going to eat something, and you're going to stay for the cake, and then Margaret is going to want to talk to you more, probably for a long time, probably about things that are going to be hard for you to hear, and you are going to let her say all of it." She paused. "Can you do that?" "Yes," he said, "I can do that." Ruth nodded. She sat down across from him. And then, after a moment, as though making a decision she had not known she would make until this moment, "Tell me something about him when he was little, something good, because I've spent a lot of years knowing only one version of that story, and I think—" She stopped. She looked out the window briefly, and then back. "I think Margaret deserves more than one version." Robert sat across from Ruth in the October light, and began, slowly and with difficulty, and with more tenderness than Margaret had expected from him, to talk about her father as a child. Thomas at 5, picking out songs by ear, on the old upright piano in the Cincinnati house. Thomas at 8, walking 2 miles to the library every Saturday because he wanted to read everything about every composer who had ever lived. Thomas at 12, saving his allowance for months to buy a second-hand guitar and teaching himself from a book, playing until his fingers bled and then playing some more, because music was the only language that made complete sense to him, the only place in the world where everything lined up. Margaret listened. She had never heard any of this. She held it carefully, this portrait of a small boy with bleeding fingers and a second-hand guitar, and she let it exist beside the portrait she already had. The man with the Christmas presents that were always slightly off, the man with the coffee and the lowered voice, the man who said, "Let's see how things look as we get closer." And she understood that both portraits were true, and that neither one was complete, and that the truth, as usual, was in the space between them. She opened the letter that evening, not at the reception, but later, after the guests had gone, and she and Daniel were alone in the hotel room they'd booked for the night, sitting together on the edge of the bed with their shoes off and the curtains open on the dark October sky. Daniel sat beside her while she read it. He didn't look over her shoulder. He just sat there, present, warm, his hand loosely on the bed near her knee. The letter was 2 pages. It was written in a handwriting that she recognized from the birthday cards that had arrived sometimes and sometimes hadn't, a slightly cramped, careful script that had always struck her as the handwriting of someone who'd been taught to write by someone strict. It began, "Margaret, I am not good at letters. I am not. I am not good at most forms of saying the thing out loud, which has been the central problem of my life, and which I am aware has been the central problem of yours too, insofar as I have been the person who was supposed to be saying things to you and was not." She read all the way through it. She read it the way you read something that is happening to you, not just at you. That is slowly, with the kind of attention you give to things that have physical weight. He did not excuse himself. Not once. He explained briefly the broad outlines of what Robert had told her in more detail, the music, the business, the years of damage compounded by more damage. He did not use it as an excuse. He used it the way an honest person uses an explanation, to offer context, not absolution. He said he was proud of her. He said it plainly, not performed, not decorated. He listed specific things he was proud of, that she had put herself through college, that she had kept her relationship with her mother whole, that she had found a person who clearly loved her by the way his father described the look on Daniel's face whenever someone mentioned her name. He said he had heard that from Robert, who had done his own research once he'd decided to come, including calling Daniel's parents in Vermont, who'd apparently talked about Margaret for 45 minutes with no signs of stopping. Near the end of the letter, he wrote, "I'm not asking for anything, Margaret. I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking you to forgive me, or to call me, or to do anything that would cost you more than you have already spent on me, which is more than I deserved. I am just telling you these things because you should know them. You should know that when I think about my life, The thing I think about most is not the things I failed to do or build or be. It's you. It's that you exist and that you turned out the way you did despite me and because of your mother, who is the best person I have ever known, and I was too broken to understand that when it mattered. But if you ever want to hear my voice, just talking, I would like that. That is the only thing I am asking for. Not forgiveness, not a relationship, not more than you have to give. Just sometime not to hear your voice. I love you. I know that doesn't fix anything. But it is true. Dad. She read it twice, then she folded it carefully and held it in both hands and looked out the window at the dark sky. Daniel waited. He's not a monster, she said finally. I always kind of thought he might be. It was easier to think that. And now? And now I think he's just broken in a very particular way. And I think he knows it. And I think knowing it and not being able to fix it is a kind of punishment that She stopped. I don't know if I'm glad he's suffering. I don't think I want that. I don't think I've ever actually wanted that, even when I was the most angry. What do you want? Daniel asked. Not leading, not directing, just asking. She thought about it for a long time. The October sky was very dark and very clear, and the stars, where they were visible between buildings, were the kind of stars that look like they've always been there and always will be, long after everyone who's ever looked at them is gone. I want my mother to have had more help, she said. I want to have had a father at the drawing table when I was 4 years old, so I didn't have to put him at the edge of the page. Her voice stayed even, but only just. I want all of the things I can't have, because they needed to happen 20 years ago, and they didn't. And I'm in the process of learning what to do with wanting things that can't be fixed. Daniel moved his hand to cover hers. But maybe, she said, maybe just hearing his voice once in a while, maybe that's, I don't know, maybe that's a start of something, not what it should have been, just what it can be now. She looked down at the letter in her hands. Is that enough? Daniel asked. No, she said honestly, but it's real. And right now I think I'd rather have something real and small than something big that I made up. She put the letter in her bag carefully in the interior pocket where she kept the things that mattered. She called her mother before she went to sleep. Ruth picked up on the second ring, which meant she was still awake and had been waiting. Are you okay? Ruth asked. Mostly, Margaret said. Are you? A pause. Mostly. He was in love with you, Margaret said. When you were young, even Robert said so. He said my father talked about you like you were the thing he'd gotten right. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. That's nice to hear, she said finally, in a voice that held a great deal in very few words, the way Ruth's voice always had. Even now, that's still nice to hear. They talked for a little while longer, not about Thomas, not about Robert, just about the small things. The potato salad had been a hit. Daniel's mother had asked Ruth for the recipe, and Ruth had given it to her, mostly, with one ingredient omitted, because some things you keep. The flowers on the altar had been beautiful. The light through the stained glass windows had been something, really something. You were beautiful today, Ruth said. In that dress, coming down that aisle, you were the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my whole life. You're biased. Enormously, Ruth agreed. Good night, baby. Good night, Mom. She put the phone down and lay back on the pillow and stared at the ceiling and thought about all of it. The empty seat with the white ribbon, the side door opening, the old man with the cane, the letter in her bag, her mother's voice on the phone, Daniel's hand covering hers. She thought about a girl at a breakfast bar in a house on Birchwood Drive, staring at a book without reading it while something hot rose in her chest. She thought about a woman in a grey Civic, driving 2 blocks before she trusted herself to speak. She thought about a boy with bleeding fingers and a second-hand guitar, playing because music was the only language that made complete sense, the only place where everything lined up. She thought about the drawing, the man at the edge of the page, almost falling off. He hadn't fallen off in the end. That was the thing about drawings. The man was still there, still on the paper, still faint and imprecise and placed wrong, but present. He had always been present in the only way he knew how to be, which was not enough, which was never enough, but which was also not nothing. She was going to call him, not tonight, not next week, maybe not for a while. But she was going to call him, and she was going to let his voice be what it was, imperfect and late and insufficient and real. And she was going to see what, if anything, could be built from that. And she was going to do it not for him, and not even entirely for herself. She was going to do it because she was 34 years old, and she was married, and she had her mother, and she had Daniel, and she had now, unexpectedly, a grandfather with a wooden cane and an old dark suit who had traveled a long way to give her something she hadn't known she was missing. And she was going to do it because she had learned, over a lifetime of learning the hard way, that letting go is not the same as giving up, and that the things we carry don't have to be carried forever, and that sometimes the unexpected appearance in a side doorway is exactly the thing you needed, even though it was nothing like what you asked for. She had not gotten the father who showed up. She had gotten something different, something that required more of her. Something that would ask her, over the coming months and years, to practice a kind of compassion that was harder and more honest than forgiveness as she had always imagined it. A compassion that didn't require the other person to have earned it, that didn't wait for the right gesture or the perfect apology, that simply decided, for its own reasons, to see the full human being inside the failing one. She wasn't there yet. She was going to take her time. But she was, finally, on her way. 3 months after the wedding, on a Tuesday evening in February, when the ground was covered in a thin, bright snow, Margaret sat in her kitchen with a cup of tea going cold on the table beside her and her phone in her hand. She had looked up the number weeks ago. She had it saved in her phone under a name she'd changed 3 times before settling on just Thomas. Just Thomas. Not Dad, not Father, just the name, just the person. The real, incomplete, complicated at the edge of the drawing person. She pressed call. It rang twice, 3 times. She started to think it might go to voicemail, started to think about what she would say, started to rehearse the beginning of something that would fit into 30 seconds. Hello? His voice. She had heard it only a handful of times in the past decade, and it was different than she remembered, older, slightly gravelled, softer around the edges. The voice of a man who had been thinking, perhaps, about the things that voice should have said, and didn't. "Hi," she said. "It's Margaret." A pause, a long pause, but not an empty one. She could feel the weight of what was in it, the sheer quantity of years and silences and second chances abandoned, and this one, this specific one, which was not abandoned, which had been answered. "Margaret," he said, just that, her name, like he needed to say it once to make sure it was real. "Yeah," she said, "it's me." Outside the kitchen window, the February snow was bright under the streetlight, absolutely still, the way snow is still before anyone has walked through it. Daniel was in the other room. She could hear the quiet sounds of his life, the specific domestic music of a person you know well enough that their ordinary sounds are a kind of comfort. "I got your letter," she said. "I wanted you to know that." "Okay," he said, in a voice that meant more than okay. "And I'm not ready to have a big conversation. Not yet. I just wanted—" She paused, thought about what she wanted, found the true thing. "I just wanted you to hear my voice," she said, "like you asked." Another pause, and then, from somewhere far away, On a line stretched across the winter country between them, the sound of her father breathing, just present. "Thank you," he said. His voice caught on it, just those two words, catching. "Okay," she said. "We'll talk more sometime." "Okay." "Thomas?" "Yeah." Robert came to the wedding. He walked me down the aisle. A very long pause. "I know," he said. "He told me. I'm glad he did." "Me too," Thomas said. "Me too." She stayed on the line for another minute, not saying much, just letting the silence be a different kind of silence than the ones she'd learned to live with. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, the silence of two people in the same moment, separated by distance and history, and the specific damage that families do to each other when they don't know better, and sometimes when they do. Then she said goodnight. He said goodnight. She hung up. She sat at her table with her cold tea and the February snow outside the window, and she felt something settle in her. Not peace exactly, not resolution, nothing so clean or complete as that. Something more like the feeling of putting down a bag you've been carrying for so long that you'd stopped noticing it was there. She would pick it up again. She knew that. There would be setbacks, there would be phone calls that went wrong and visits that were too hard, and the old anger rising at inconvenient times. This was not a fixed thing. This was a beginning, and beginnings are not the same as endings. But it was real. It was a real beginning, and real things, she had learned, are always worth more than the perfect things you make up. She picked up her cup. The tea was cold, but she drank it anyway, slowly, looking out at the still white snow, and she thought that her mother would be proud of her, and she thought that Robert, somewhere in Oregon, probably knew something like this was happening, and she thought that in some small room in Phoenix, a man who had loved music and never quite found his way back to it, was sitting with his own cold cup and his own window, and his own private reckoning with the weight of things. And she thought, well, here we are, all of us, imperfect and late and insufficient and real. Here we are, trying. The drawing she made when she was 4 years old, the one with the yellow-haired mother and the small girl and the man at the edge of the page. Ruth still had it. She kept it in a box with important papers, the kind of box that survives every move and every clean-out, because some things you simply do not throw away. Margaret had looked at it once, not long ago, taking it out carefully from the box. She'd held it under the kitchen light and looked at that small crayon man at the edge of the paper, almost falling off. He hadn't fallen off. He was still there, clumsily drawn, placed wrong, colors slightly off. But there. That, she thought, might be the most honest picture of her family she had ever seen, and maybe, just maybe, honest was enough to begin with. If this story reached inside you and touched something that has been waiting to be touched, something about the people who should have shown up and didn't, something about the love that arrives late and incomplete and real, then subscribe to this channel and ring that bell. Every single week there is a new story here, a new person who was underestimated, overlooked, pushed to the edge of the page, a new moment where the side door opens and something unexpected walks through. Stories that remind you, the way the best stories always do, that the human heart is more resilient and more complicated and more capable of beginning again than anyone ever gives it credit for. Come back next week. Bring someone with you who needs to hear this. We'll be here.